Hey there, I'm Michael. Take a seat while I tell you about Dungeons of Infinity by Jack Spoerner. So, what is this game? Well, as you can see, there is a lot to it. There's a lot of cards, tiles, but what it comes down to is dungeon crawling. Now, this isn't your typical dungeon crawl, I would say. It's got a lot of different, unusual things going for it, though. But at the end of the day, as you can see, there is a lot to this game. There is 3 books here for rules. So you've got one that's kind of a introduction rules that you follow through. You've then got the big chunky reference rules that's got all the details. And then you've got a scenario and quest book. And that's because this game has a few different ways to play. Now, one is you can pick a scenario and follow through the scenario, and the different scenarios will play out in different ways with different goals and potentially different setup instructions. So there's a lot of replay value being added by this. And then the campaign options introduces a story element that runs through from game to game, and you're able to keep your hero and get stronger and stronger as you progress. So those are 2 different ways. The way you play, though, is mostly the same. You will have your person, they will be in the dungeon, and you will use action points to choose what to do. So the character you are will depend how many action points you get. You see, some characters are swift and nimble and able to do lots. Others are a bit slowed down, wearing heavy armour, and not really that capable of doing much. And so, depending on the amount of action points you have will depend what you can do. Now, you can do standard things like move for one, run, things like that, and get into attacks, etc. But then you also each have your own unique ability cards. Now, a lot of these will just relate to battles, but the interesting thing with these is they have varying costs, and also they will power up as you level up. And in this, you have this lovely system of leveling up as you play, and then if you're doing a campaign, you can keep that from game to game, which is nice. Once you've done your turn, it would then be the next person's, and you just keep doing round after round. But as you are exploring this dungeon, you'll either have a set dungeon that will already have tokens out that indicate the type of thing that you might find on that tile, or when you go onto a new tile, you'll roll the dice and check the dice against the room content chart that you're using for that scenario or for that specific mission of the campaign type thing. And that will then tell you which one of these cards is going to be there. So you'd put a token there, and then it's when you are in that room, that token will trigger and it will reveal, and you'll flip a card over, and it could do all sorts of different things. And the interesting thing here is that allows for variability as to which deck you're going to, of 4 different decks with different likelihoods of outcomes. And it also allows that you can stack these decks, you can build these decks to give a specific series of events. And that works very nicely for that campaign mode, because some of the cards in here are event cards. And these event cards, when you're forming the deck for that specific mission, you have to shuffle that event in there, and then that event triggers, and then you'll look in here and you'll read and you'll see what that event is, and it's like, oh, exciting, you've got like a proper role play experience of things happening that you never knew were going to happen, at least for the first time you play. And that's really nice to have. And then events might lead into other events, etc., etc. And so it progresses nicely without the need for a dungeon master, a GM, whatever you want to call it, the Alls v1. This is a fully co-op game, so that's really nice. So I've been talking a lot about kind of in general how the game plays, and my thoughts as I've been going, really, which isn't my usual kind of structure. But this game is so big and so encompassing that it's hard to kind of break it down and split it out and talk about it in that way. And with the different play modes, there's just so much going on. But I will say with artwork, the artwork originally drew me to this game. It's this CGI artwork. It just really liked the character portraits and that drew me in. It's a shame that currently the rest of the art is not to the same kind of level. A lot of the cards are lacking a lot of art. But obviously that's why they're doing a Kickstarter, to help fund that kind of thing. Now, with regards to components, again, because this is a prototype, none of these components are finished, so I can't really talk about that. Another thing I do want to talk about with regards to the gameplay is an interesting, although strange thing, whereby there is a merchant at the entrance to every dungeon, because he's followed you there for some reason. Some people off to danger, I will follow them into danger. I don't know. But it always makes me think of, if you ever played Resident Evil, I think it was 4 or 5, that was on the Wii. There was this merchant just in random places in that, and it's the same guy everywhere. That's who I imagine with regards to this merchant. But yeah, it's a nice system. So you start the game without any equipment but a bit of money that you're then able to go to this merchant who you start with before you take your first turn and buy a bit of equipment, you know. And the best equipment, though, you'll get from rewards. And these rewards are also kind of the main way that you'll get money to buy other equipment you might want. But there is also very useful kind of story element equipment. If you're doing some of the campaign, for example, you might have things happen that you could really use some mundane items like a pickaxe or some rope or something like that. But because you're adventurers, you were just like, weapons, armor, and then you're completely messed up. And you struggle like anything, and you're like, I wish I'd just paid a gold for that. And so that's really nice and interesting. The way you get these rewards is by having fights. So I spoke before about these cards and how they can trigger things, they can trigger events, all sorts of different things, really. At the end of the day, it's a deck of cards. They can do whatever you want. So that's really useful and versatile. But one of the things these will do is cause enemies to appear. And the system for enemies is that you have rows that get built of free cards. And every free cards of enemies gives you a reward. Now, the back ones are basically out of range. They can't get to you because of the forward ones unless they've got ranged weapons. So that's an interesting way of having depth and range within a game without having it being that you're measuring out squares. So that is interesting and nice to have. Now, the current graphic design isn't terribly intuitive a lot of the time on these, but you do get used to it eventually. And once you're in a combat, you'll roll a dice to resolve combats. Basically, they'll hit you, you'll hit them until they die. It's kind of just your typical dungeon crawl with respect to that. But then, once you've killed them, you'll get to pick up the tasty rewards that we were talking about. So another thing about this that is different, so the things that I've enjoyed most about this are the things that are different. It's that story aspect and the way it develops because of the event cards put in there. And it's also the, I guess the AI, you would say, and I guess that applies in both his circumstances, really. It is AI, but the AI of the bosses and when they appear. So it's randomized to a point in that if you were rolling a dice, it would be random. But with this, it becomes more common depending on the actions you take, etc. So for each character, there are certain actions that if you do those actions, you have to, at the end of your turn, draw a boss event card. And the boss event cards have two functions. Firstly, if you draw one and it has a number on that is a room that's out, the boss will appear in that room. So that is interesting. But then once the boss is out, it will also move the boss. And it won't always move the boss in the same way. Sometimes it's towards someone who has a specific amount of noise. A noise is another character stat. Sometimes it's the one with the most noise, least noise, etc. Sometimes they'll break combat, sometimes they won't. So that makes for a very changing and variable game. But at the same time, because you're not always putting these back and reshuffling them, and again, you can stack this to create a specific storyline of a boss acting, is really interesting to see. So overall, the downsides on this were the rulebook. And it's just because it is such a complex game. There is so much to think about, so much going on, and so much that isn't necessarily intuitive because you haven't encountered that style of rule in other games, that it is hard work. And I do feel that, you know, I've spoken to the designer about this. He has said that as part of the Kickstarter, they're looking to get someone to go over the rules and properly do the rules who isn't the designer themselves, and I think that will really benefit the game. And that was the main stumbling block for a lot of players, was the rules there. Now, another thing that personally annoyed me at times was the unpredictable nature of the length of games, especially when you were doing the randomized dungeons for some of the scenarios rather than through the campaign. The length of game could be very variable, just depending on what happened with regards to the dice rolls, etc. What happened with when the boss went out. You can have the boss come out pretty quickly sometimes, and then you just get annihilated. So that can be frustrating. And then other times you can be there, you're just plugging along, and it just goes on and on and on. So that's another thing I would like to see be worked on a bit. But I think if you plan, it is typically about 2 hours in my experience for one of the random scenarios. The first starting introduction mission, it takes about the same, just because you're getting used to the rules a bit there. And I'd say kind of the later missions, again, because it starts having a bit of randomize, it can be variable. But 2 hours is probably the average. But I've had some go half hour, 45 minutes, and some go 5 or 6 hours. So that is extreme example though. So overall, yes, downsize, rules, game length, but the things going for it, you've got the artificial intelligence of how the boss comes out, how it responds, your ability to stack and create decks for regards to the artificial intelligence of the dungeon and events and things happening is fantastic to see and really interesting. The other thing that's really nice about this is the leveling system, the fact that you're leveling up as you play, and you can also level up through a campaign is nice and flexible, and I like to be able to do that and get a sense of progression and growth going on. And a lot of actions that you can perform will give you XP, so there tends to often be a feeling of just gradually increasing. Each time you take a turn you might gain 1 XP. Sometimes you won't gain an XP in a turn, but another turn you'll gain 2 or 3, and so you really do get a sense of developing during the game in a way that I've not seen with any other dungeon crawl games. So that is Dungeons of Infinity. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please do check out the rest of the videos on the channel, as well as subscribing and sharing the channel. And as always, thanks for watching, and bye for now.